The river is burning, not metaphor, not illusion. Actual flame moves across the water's surface, logs ablaze and spinning in current that no longer cools, but scalds. A woman stands waist deep, holding a child's head above the waves, and when she turns her face skyward to breathe, the air itself ignites her hair. She screams once, then submerges again. Around her, cattle thrash and drown. A man clutches the horn of a cow, using the animal's bulk as a shield against embers the size of dinner plates that rain from a sky no longer visible. The water is hot, not warm, hot, and getting hotter. Somewhere in the chaos, a 13-year-old German girl has found that same desperate strategy, clinging to a cow's horn for 5 hours while the world above the waterline ceases to exist. This is not how the day began. This is not how anyone imagined Sunday, October 8, 1871, would end, but in the span of a single breath, between a distant rumble and the moment when oxygen itself became a weapon, everything that was Peshtigo, Wisconsin, stopped being. 48 hours earlier, the town was wood and pride. 2,000 people called this place home, most of them tied to William Ogden's lumber empire, the same William Ogden who served as Chicago's first mayor and saw in these northeastern Wisconsin forests an endless supply of timber for a nation building itself westward. Peshtigo was not a gentle place. It was a working place. The air smelled of sawdust and sweat. The Peshtigo River ran clean and cold through the center of town, dividing east from west, carrying logs downstream to the company mill, where blades screamed from dawn until dusk. Men worked 12-hour shifts. Women kept boarding houses. Children played in streets that turned to mud when it rained, which it had not done in months. The summer of 1871 had been a stranger. By September, the drought had pressed the land flat. Leaves turned brown before they turned gold. Streams that should have run year-round went dry. In the forests surrounding Peshtigo, the logging operations left behind slash. Branches, bark, needles, everything that wasn't valuable lumber. And that slash lay in heaps taller than houses, tinder waiting for a spark that everyone knew would come, but no one could predict. Small fires had been burning for weeks, farmers clearing land, loggers burning waste. The smell of smoke became as common as the smell of bread. People stopped noticing. By early October, the air tasted of ash, and still no one worried because fire was part of the work, part of the landscape, part of the bargain you made when you lived in a place where trees were currency. On the evening of October 8th, the wind changed, not gradually, not with warning. It came from the southwest like a freight train someone forgot to brake, gusting past 50 miles per hour, then 70, then speeds that would later be estimated at over 100. The small fires, those scattered, controllable burns that had smoldered for weeks, lifted off the ground. They joined. They became something else. Witnesses would later struggle for language, reaching for words like tornado and hurricane and firestorm, but none of those words were quite right, because what approached Peshtigo around 8:30 that night was a phenomenon that would take another 70 years to name properly. It was a firestorm, a self-sustaining convection system in which superheated air rises so fast it creates its own wind, its own weather, its own apocalypse. Father Peter Pernin, the priest at St. Mary's Catholic Church, was among the first to understand that this fire was different. He had been watching the horizon for hours, noting the unnatural red glow that seemed to pulse and spread. Around 9 o'clock he heard it, a distant roar, muffled at first, like a waterfall heard through a closed door, then louder still. The sound grew into something that defied description, not one sound but many, layered and terrible. Wind and fire and the crack of trees exploding from internal steam pressure. Pernin grabbed a tabernacle from his church and a few sacred items, placed them in a wagon, and began making his way toward the river. He had no plan beyond that. The river was the only place that made sense. The river was the only place that might not burn. He was not alone in that instinct. All over Peshtigo, people were beginning to run. At first, the movement was tentative. Families gathering valuables, locking doors as if this might be like the other fires, containable, survivable. But then the wind hit. It blew grown men off their feet. It drove dust and smoke into eyes with such force that people staggered blind through their own streets. And then the fire arrived, not creeping but leaping, not spreading but exploding from structure to structure, as if distance meant nothing. Eyewitnesses would later describe fireballs, great spheres of flame that rose from the forest, sailed through the air, and landed on rooftops a quarter-mile away. Others spoke of sheets of fire that seemed to fall from the sky rather than rise from the ground. The phenomenon was real. The firestorm was creating fire whirls, vertical vortices of flame that behaved like tornadoes, lifting rail cars, throwing houses off foundations, turning physics into nightmare. By 9:30, Peshtigo was burning from every direction at once. The company boarding house on the west side of the river was a 3-story wooden structure that had always seemed solid, permanent. 75 people took refuge there, reasoning that size meant safety, that walls meant protection. They were wrong. Within minutes, the building was engulfed. Everyone inside died. Their screams were brief. The fire consumed available oxygen faster than lungs could draw it in. People who tried to flee the boarding house burst into flames before they reached the door. The heat was so intense, later estimated at up to 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, that iron melted, brick crumbled, and wood sometimes remained untouched mere feet away from molten metal. Survivors would later speak of this paradox with confusion bordering on madness, how a cast-iron fire engine could melt into a puddle while the wooden wheel beside it showed no char. The bridge across the Peshtigo River became a bottleneck of terror. Families with wagons, single men running, women carrying children, cattle driven by panic, all converged on the narrow span at the same moment. The bridge was wood. The bridge was old. The bridge was, by 9:45, on fire. Father Pernin crossed it while flames licked the railings, pressed on all sides by bodies moving in both directions. Some fleeing toward the east side, others trying to reach the west, none of them truly knowing which direction meant life. He made it across. The bridge collapsed 10 minutes later, and everyone still on it fell into the river below, some already burning, some struck by falling timbers, most of them drowning in water that was rapidly becoming too hot to bear. On the east bank, chaos had structure only in the sense that everyone was moving toward water. The Peshtigo River was not wide, maybe 50 feet at most points, but it was deep enough, cold enough, and in those first minutes it seemed like salvation. Hundreds waded in, hundreds more followed. They stood chest deep, shoulder deep, some holding children above the surface, others dunking themselves completely and rising only when lungs screamed for air. But the air was no longer safe. Each breath above water brought searing heat and smoke so thick it was more solid than gas. People's lungs burned, their throats closed, some suffocated, standing upright, eyes open, still technically alive, but no longer able to process oxygen. And then the river began to heat. Not everywhere, not uniformly, but in pockets where burning logs collected. Where the banks themselves were aflame, the water temperature rose. Survivors would later testify to this with the bewilderment of people describing something that should not be possible. The river was hot. One woman told her grandchildren that her father had gathered heavy winter coats, soaked them in the river, and placed them over the children's heads, not to keep them warm, but to shield them from heat. The water beneath those coats was hot enough to scald. Another account spoke of people boiling to death in wells they had jumped into for safety, the stone walls conducting heat until the water inside reached lethal temperatures. Livestock added another layer of horror. Horses, cattle, pigs, all of them driven by the same survival instinct as the humans, stampeded into the river. They trampled children. They crushed women trying to hold their footing against current and wind. A man named Alexander Doe, a teenager at the time, was lowered by his father into a well that had only inches of water at the bottom. He and his siblings huddled there in the dark, breathing air that tasted like copper and ash, listening to the world above them roar and crack and scream. They survived. Many who made similar choices did not. In Williamsonville, a small community just north of Peshtigo, 7 men sought refuge in a well. 5 survived. 2 boiled. In the potato fields east of town, 35 people gathered in a cleared patch of earth, reasoning that without fuel the fire could not reach them. They were wrong. The firestorm did not need ground fuel. It created its own. Superheated air ignited clothing, hair, skin. All 35 died huddled together, some with arms still wrapped around one another, some curled inward as if trying to protect organs that were already cooking from the inside out. 2 men, unable to endure the agony, beat their own heads against a stump until they stopped breathing. By 10 o'clock, the fire had reached its peak intensity. The sound was beyond comprehension. A continuous roar punctuated by sharp cracks as trees exploded, dull thuds as buildings collapsed, and beneath it all, the high-pitched wail of wind through superheated air. The sky was no longer visible. There was only flame and smoke and a red glow so pervasive it seemed to come from the earth itself. People in Green Bay, 30 miles south, could read newspapers by the light of the Peshtigo Fire. Sailors on Lake Michigan reported seeing the glow from 40 miles offshore. Father Pernin stood in the river for over 5 hours. He had abandoned his wagon, his tabernacle, everything he thought mattered. Now he simply held his position in water that was frigid in some places, scalding in others, his body numb from cold, below the waist, burned raw above. Around him, people died of hypothermia. Around him, people died of burns. Around him, people simply gave up, let go, and slipped beneath the surface. He watched a man he knew, a strong man, a logger, try to swim to the far bank. The man made it halfway before his clothes caught fire. He sank without a sound. On the west side of the river, in the low, marshy ground that would later be credited with saving more lives than any other single location, over 100 people lay face down in mud that was too wet to burn and too shallow to drown in. They pressed their faces into the earth, breathing through wet cloth, through cupped hands, through the tiny gaps in the reeds. The heat above them was lethal. The heat below them was bearable. They stayed there for hours, motionless, silent, some of them unconscious, some of them praying, some of them already dead, but not yet alone. Midnight came and went without distinction. There was no darkness to mark its passage, only the gradual realization among those still alive that the roar was diminishing, that the wind was easing, that the air, while still thick with smoke, was no longer hot enough to sear lungs on contact. People began to lift their heads. They began to look around. They began to understand what had happened. Peshtigo was gone, not damaged, not burned, gone. Of the 2,000 people who had lived in the downtown area, 800 were dead. The exact number would never be known because entire families had vanished, leaving no one to report them missing. Houses that had stood for a decade were reduced to ash so fine it blew away in the morning breeze. The company store, the sawmill, the church, the schoolhouse, all gone. The only structures still standing were a house on the far eastern edge of town and a barn on the western outskirts, both of them untouched by some quirk of wind or fate that no one could explain. Dawn on October 9th arrived gray and silent. Survivors emerged from the river, from the wells, from the mud flats and the potato fields and the cellars that had somehow not become ovens. They moved through streets that were no longer streets, past foundations that were no longer recognizable as homes. Everything was ash. Everything was bone. In some places, bodies lay in clusters, families who had died together. In others, lone figures were found in positions that suggested they had been running when the oxygen gave out and their lungs simply stopped. Many corpses were burned beyond recognition. Some were identified by jewelry that had survived the heat. A young woman named Maggie Haney was found in Williamsonville. Her body charred, but the breastpin on her dress still intact. A small piece of metal that allowed her name to be added to the list of the dead instead of the list of the missing. R.M. Wright, a survivor who had spent the night in the river, walked to Williamsonville on the morning of the 9th. He found 35 bodies stacked in a pile. More were scattered in the fields and along the roadside. Entire blocks of forest had been reduced to standing black poles. Every branch gone, every leaf incinerated. The ground was still hot. His shoes left prints in ash that was inches deep. He saw a dog still alive, its fur burned away, wandering in circles. He saw a man sitting upright against a tree, looking almost peaceful, except that the man was dead, and the tree was black. In Peshtigo proper, mass graves were dug. There was no time for individual burials, no way to identify most of the dead, no resources to do anything but gather the bodies and cover them with earth. One grave held over 300 people, another held 200. Families were separated in death as they had been in life, thrown together with strangers because the fire had erased all distinctions except alive and not. The scope of the disaster extended far beyond Peshtigo. The same firestorm had torn through 17 towns across northeastern Wisconsin and the upper peninsula of Michigan. Brussels, Williamsonville, Birch Creek, Robinsonville, Menacon, all were destroyed. In total, the fire burned between 1.2 and 1.5 million acres, a swath of destruction 10 miles wide and 40 miles long. The death toll across the entire region was estimated between 1,200 and 2,500 people. The exact number would remain unknown because so many communities were completely obliterated, leaving no census records, no survivors to testify, no way to count the missing. On the same night, Chicago burned. The Great Chicago Fire would dominate headlines for weeks, capturing national attention with its dramatic images of a great city brought low. Peshtigo, by contrast, was forgotten almost immediately. It was too remote, too small, too difficult to reach. Reporters who made the journey north found a scene so bleak, so total in its devastation that language failed them. One correspondent described the town as a graveyard of ashes where nothing moves but the wind. Another wrote simply, "There is no Peshtigo." Relief efforts were slow and inadequate. Wisconsin Governor Lucius Fairchild toured the affected area a week after the fire and was so shaken by what he saw that he reportedly wept in public. Donations arrived from across the country, but they were a fraction of what Chicago received. Survivors were given blankets, flour, and a few dollars in cash, then left to rebuild in a landscape that looked like the surface of the moon. Some did rebuild. By 1872, a new Peshtigo was rising from the ashes, smaller and more cautious, but still a lumber town, because that was the only economy anyone knew. Others left and never came back, unable to sleep in a place where the smell of smoke still seemed to linger years later. A man named Cubby Cuvillian, who had lived to the age of 95, remembered talking as a child to an elderly woman who had survived the fire as a girl. She told him about seeing a woman run past her house with her head on fire, screaming in a voice that did not sound human. She told him about the smell, not just smoke, but burning meat, burning hair, burning things that should never burn. She told him she never felt safe in autumn again, when the air turned dry and the wind came from the west. In the decades that followed, scientists and military strategists studied the Peshtigo Fire with intense interest. During World War II, both American and British planners examined what they called the Peshtigo paradigm, trying to understand how a firestorm forms, how it sustains itself, how it can be replicated. The bombing of Dresden and Tokyo, the firestorms that consumed those cities, were informed in part by what had happened in a small Wisconsin lumber town on a Sunday night in 1871. The fire became a tool, a weapon, a lesson in how heat and wind and fuel could combine to erase a place so thoroughly that even the memory of it struggled to survive. Today, Peshtigo is a quiet town of about 3,500 people. The river still runs through the center. A bridge still crosses it, though not the same bridge. On the east bank, near where hundreds stood in scalding water while the world burned around them, there is a memorial, a simple stone marker, listing the names of the dead, or at least the names that could be confirmed. Many of the names are followed by "and family," because no one knows how many children were lost, how many infants died in arms that could not hold them above the heat. The Peshtigo Fire Museum stands on Oconto Street, a small building filled with artifacts that somehow survived: a melted iron kettle, a charred Bible, a child's shoe. There are photographs of survivors taken years later, old men and women with eyes that look past the camera into some distance that no lens can capture. There are letters, too, written in careful script by people who wanted someone, anyone, to know what it had been like. One letter, penned by a woman named Sarah, describes the moment she realized she could not save all her children. She had 4. She saved 2. The letter does not say how she chose. The fire cemetery, located on the northern edge of town, is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. It is a mass grave, carefully maintained, with individual markers added over the years, as descendants researched family histories and discovered relatives they never knew existed. Every October 8th, a memorial service is held. Fewer people attend each year. The survivors are long gone, their children are gone, even their grandchildren are mostly gone. What remains is a story, and stories are fragile things, easily forgotten in a world that moves faster than fire, but the ground remembers. Dig down 6 feet anywhere in central Peshtigo and you will hit a layer of charcoal. Dig down further and you will find artifacts: nails, hinges, fragments of glass melted into strange shapes. These are not relics, they are markers. They are proof that this place existed, that it burned, that it mattered. The forests surrounding Peshtigo have grown back, denser than before, green and seemingly eternal. But foresters who work these woods know that the old-growth trees are gone forever, that what grows now is second- and third-generation timber, smaller, younger, less valuable. The soil itself is different, enriched by ash, changed at a molecular level by heat that turned sand into glass, and clay into pottery. In 2021, on the 150th anniversary of the fire, researchers used ground-penetrating radar to search for additional mass graves. They found 3. The bodies inside had never been counted in the official death toll. Some of the remains were children, some were so small they might have been infants. The researchers took samples for DNA analysis, hoping to match them with living descendants, but most of the families who might have claimed them are extinct. The genetic lines ended by fire or time or simple bad luck. Historians who study the Peshtigo Fire are struck by how little it changed. The lumber industry continued almost without interruption. Trees were cut, mills were rebuilt, profits flowed. There were no new fire safety regulations, no mandatory fire breaks, no organized firefighting forces. The same conditions that created the firestorm in 1871 persisted for decades. Wisconsin would see major fires again in 1894, in 1908, in 1918, and each time people would express shock and grief and promise that it would never happen again, and each time it did. What the fire did change was memory. The survivors carried it with them in ways that were both subtle and profound. They named their children after the dead. They refused to use fireplaces, even in the coldest winters. They woke in the night to the smell of smoke that was not there. One man interviewed in his 80s said he still could not hear the wind without feeling his heart race. Another said she had never learned to swim because the river, any river, reminded her of that night when water was supposed to save you, but instead became another way to die. Father Pernin wrote an eyewitness account of the fire published in 1874 that remains the most detailed first-hand record of the event. In it, he describes standing in the river, watching the bridges burn, seeing people he knew transformed into living torches that ran a few steps and then collapsed. He describes the sound, like 10,000 freight trains at once, and the smell, which he says was the smell of hell itself, though I do not claim to know what hell smells like. He describes the silence that came after, which was worse than the noise, because in the silence, You could hear people calling for children who would never answer. He also describes something harder to quantify: the way time stopped making sense. He says that the 2 hours of the firestorm felt like 2 minutes and 2 years at the same time, that he could remember every second in perfect detail, but also that large stretches of the night were simply gone from his memory, erased not by trauma, but by the brain's refusal to store what it could not process. Other survivors reported the same phenomenon. They could tell you the color of the flames: blue at the base, yellow in the middle, red at the top. But they could not tell you how long they stood in the river. They could describe the face of a stranger they helped, but not the face of their own spouse. Memory, like the town itself, was burned in patches. Some parts preserved, others utterly destroyed. 50 years after the fire, the survivors held a reunion in Peshtigo. There were fewer than 20 of them left, old men and women who had been children on that October night. They gathered in the new town hall, which stood on the site where the old company store had been. They shared stories, though not easily. Most of them had spent 5 decades not talking about it, trying to forget, trying to move on. But in that room, with those people, the memories came back with a clarity that frightened them. One woman said she could suddenly smell the smoke again. A man said he could hear the roar. They held hands and wept, and then they went back to their homes and their silence because there was nothing else to do. The 1951 reunion was smaller, only 7 survivors. They posed for a photograph that now hangs in the museum, 7 ancient faces staring at the camera with expressions that are hard to read. Not sad, not angry, just present, just here, just alive when so many were not. The youngest of them was 86. The oldest was 93. They are all dead now. The last survivor died in 1959, 88 years after the fire, having outlived the event by nearly a century, but never, according to her children, truly leaving it behind. What remains now is a question of witness. How do we remember a disaster that killed more people than any wildfire in American history, in a place most Americans have never heard of, at a time so distant it might as well be mythology? The answer, such as it is, lies in small acts of preservation: the museum, the cemetery, the annual memorial service, the stories passed down even when the details blur and the names are forgotten, and in the land itself, which holds its secrets close, in the layers of ash beneath the streets, in the trees that grow tall but never as tall as they once did, in the river which still runs cold and clear, carrying water that has no memory but whose banks remember everything. Stand on the bridge on a quiet night in October, when the wind comes from the southwest and the air is dry and you can almost hear it. A distant roar, muffled at first, like a waterfall heard through a closed door. Not real, not now, but not entirely absent either. An echo, a warning, a reminder that fire does not care about names or plans, or the confident belief that disaster is something that happens to other people in other places at other times. Peshtigo burned in 2 hours. It took a century to rebuild what could be rebuilt. And some things, most things, could never be replaced. The population never returned to what it was before the fire. The trust never returned. The sense that the world was a place where effort equaled safety, where hard work meant survival, where doing the right thing mattered. All of that burned away and left only the stubborn insistence that life continues because there is no alternative. Walk through the fire cemetery on an autumn afternoon. The leaves are turning. The air smells like smoke from someone's fireplace. The headstones are weathered, the inscriptions fading. Some of them simply say unknown. Others say mother or child, because even gender and age were sometimes impossible to determine. There is no sound except the wind in the trees and faintly the river moving over stones. This is what remains. This is what we carry forward. Not the fire itself, which lasted 2 hours on a Sunday night in 1871, but the space it left behind. A silence shaped like a town, a grief shaped like 1,000 names, a warning shaped like a river that once burned and might, under the right conditions, burn again. The wind picks up. The leaves scatter. A single piece of ash, old ash, ancient ash, ash that might have been part of a house or a tree or a human being, lifts from the ground and spirals upward, catching the light before it disappears into the sky. And somewhere, in a place beyond memory but not beyond reach, the fire continues to burn, not because it is fed, but because it is remembered, and remembering is the only thing that stands between what happened and oblivion. The river is cold now. The river is clean. The river will never boil again. But it did once, and that is enough to change everything.